The Texas Revolution began when colonists in the Mexican province of Texas rebelled against the increasingly centralist Mexican government. After a decade of political and cultural clashes between the Mexican government and the increasingly large population of American settlers in Texas, hostilities erupted in October 1835. Texians disagreed on whether the ultimate goal was independence or a return to the Mexican Constitution of 1824, while delegates at the consultation debated the war's motives. Texians and a flood of volunteers from the United States defeated the small garrisons of Mexican soldiers by mid-December 1835. The consultation declined to declare independence and installed an interim government, whose infighting led to political paralysis and a dearth of effective governance in Texas. An ill-conceived proposal to invade Matamoros siphoned much-needed volunteers and provisions from the fledgling Texas Army. In March 1836, a second political convention declared independence and appointed leadership for the new Republic of Texas. Determined to avenge Mexico's honor, President Antonio López de Santa Anna vowed to personally retake Texas. His Army of Operations entered Texas in mid-February 1836 and found the Texians completely unprepared. Mexican General José de Aria led a contingent of troops on the Goliad campaign up the Texas coast, defeating all Texian troops in his path and executing most of those who surrendered. Santa Anna led a larger force to San Antonio de Texas, where his troops defeated the Texian garrison in the Battle of the Alamo, killing almost all of the defenders. For the next month, a newly created Texian army under the command of Sam Houston steadily retreated towards the border with Louisiana. Terrified civilians fled with the army in a melee known as the Runaway Scrape. On March 31, Houston paused his men at Gross's Landing on the Brazos River, and for the next 2 weeks, the Texians received rigorous military training. Becoming complacent and underestimating the strength of his foes, Santa Anna further subdivided his troops. On April 21, Houston's army staged a surprise assault on Santa Anna and his vanguard force at the Battle of San Jacinto. The Mexican troops were quickly routed, and vengeful Texians executed many who tried to surrender. Santa Anna was taken hostage. In exchange for his life, he ordered the Mexican army to retreat south of the Rio Grande. Mexico refused to recognize the Republic of Texas, and intermittent conflicts between the two nations continued into the 1840s. The annexation of Texas as the 28th state of the United States, in 1845, led directly to the Mexican-American War. Background: after a failed attempt by France to colonize Texas in the late 17th century, Spain developed a plan to settle the region. On its southern edge, along the Medina and Nueces rivers, Spanish Texas was bordered by the province of Coahuila. On the east, Texas bordered Louisiana. Following the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the United States also claimed the land west of the Sabine River, all the way to the Rio Grande. Although the United States officially renounced that claim as part of the Transcontinental Treaty with Spain in 1819, many Americans continued to believe that Texas should belong to their nation, and over the next decade the United States made several offers to purchase the region. Following the Mexican War of Independence, Texas became part of Mexico. Under the Constitution of 1824, which defined the country as a federal republic, the provinces of Texas and Coahuila were combined to become the state Coahuila y Texas. Texas was granted only a single seat in the state legislature, which met in Saltillo, hundreds of miles away. After months of grumbling by Taínos outraged at the loss of their political autonomy, state officials agreed to make Texas a department of the new state, with a de facto capital in San Antonio de Texas. Texas was very sparsely populated, with fewer than 3,500 residents, and only about 200 soldiers. which made it extremely vulnerable to attacks by native tribes and American filibusters. In the hopes that an influx of settlers could control the Indian raids, the bankrupt Mexican government liberalized immigration policies for the region. Finally able to settle legally in Texas, Anglos from the United States soon vastly outnumbered the Taínos. Most of the immigrants came from the southern United States. Many were slave owners, and most brought with them significant prejudices against other races, attitudes often applied to the Taínos. Mexico's official religion was Roman Catholicism, yet the majority of the immigrants were Protestants who distrusted Catholics. Mexican authorities became increasingly concerned about the stability of the region. The colonies teetered at the brink of revolt in 1829, after Mexico abolished slavery. In response, President Anastasio Bustamante implemented the laws of April 6, 1830, which, among other things, prohibited further immigration to Texas from the United States, increased taxes, and reiterated the ban on slavery. Settlers simply circumvented or ignored the laws. By 1834, an estimated 30,000 Anglos lived in Coahuila, Texas, compared to only 7,800 Mexican-born residents. In 1832, Antonio López de Santa Anna led a revolt to overthrow Bustamante. Texians, or English-speaking settlers, used the rebellion as an excuse to take up arms. By mid-August, all Mexican troops had been expelled from East Texas. Buoyed by their success, Texians held two political conventions to persuade Mexican authorities to weaken the laws of April 6, 1830. In November 1833, the Mexican government attempted to address some of the concerns, repealing some sections of the law and granting the colonists further concessions, including increased representation in the state legislature. Stephen F. Austin, who had brought the first American settlers to Texas, wrote to a friend that, "Every evil complained of has been remedied." Mexican authorities were quietly watchful, concerned that the colonists were maneuvering toward secession. Santa Anna soon revealed himself to be a centralist, transitioning the Mexican government to a centralized government. In 1835, the 1824 Constitution was overturned, state legislatures were dismissed, militias disbanded. Federalists throughout Mexico were appalled. Citizens in the states of Oaxaca and Zacatecas took up arms. After Santa Anna's troops subdued the rebellion in Zacatecas in May, he gave his troops 2 days to pillage the city. Over 2,000 non-combatants were killed. The governor of Coahuila, Texas, Agustín Vizcarra, refused to dissolve the legislature, instead ordering that the session reconvene in Texas. Further from the influence of the Mexican army. Although prominent Taíno once again raised a militia company to assist the governor, the Ayuntamiento ordered him not to interfere, and Vizcarra was arrested before he reached Texas. Public opinion in Texas was divided. Editorials in the United States began advocating complete independence for Texas. After several men staged a minor revolt against customs duties in Anahuac in June, local leaders began calling for a public meeting to determine whether a majority of settlers favored independence, a return to federalism, or the status quo. Although some leaders worried that Mexican officials would see this type of gathering as a step towards revolution, by the end of August most communities had agreed to send delegates to the consultation, scheduled for October 15. As early as April 1835, military commanders in Texas began requesting reinforcements, fearing the citizens would revolt. Mexico was ill-prepared for a large civil war, but continued unrest in Texas posed a significant danger to the power of Santa Anna and of Mexico. If the people of Coahuila also took up arms, Mexico faced losing a large portion of its territory. Without the northeastern province to act as a buffer, it was likely that United States influence would spread, and the Mexican territories of Nuevo Mexico and Alta California would be at risk of future American encroachment. Santa Anna had no wish to tangle with the United States, and he knew that the unrest needed to be subdued before the United States could be convinced to become involved. In early September, Santa Anna ordered his brother-in-law, General Martin Perfecto de Cos, to lead 500 soldiers to Texas to quell any potential rebellion. Cos and his men landed at the port of Copano on September 20. Austin called on all municipalities to raise militias to defend themselves. Texian Offensive. October–December 1835. Gonzales. In the early 1830s, the Army loaned the citizens of Gonzales a small cannon for protection against Indian raids. After a Mexican soldier bludgeoned a Gonzales resident on September 10, 1835, tensions rose even further, and Mexican authorities felt it unwise to leave the settlers with a weapon. Colonel Domingo de Ugarte, commander of all Mexican military forces in Texas, sent a small detachment of troops to retrieve the cannon. After settlers escorted the group from town without the cannon, Ugarte sent 100 dragoons with Lieutenant Francisco de Castaneda to demand compliance with orders to avoid force if possible. Many of the settlers believed Mexican authorities were manufacturing an excuse to attack the town and eliminate the militia. Texians stalled Castaneda's attempts to negotiate the cannon's return for several days as they waited for reinforcements from other colonies. In the early hours of October 2, approximately 140 Texian volunteers attacked Castaneda's force. After a brief skirmish, Castaneda requested a meeting with Texian leader John Henry Moore. Castaneda revealed that he shared their Federalist leanings, but that he was honor-bound to follow orders. As Moore returned to camp, the Texians raised a homemade white banner with an image of the cannon painted in black in the center, over the words, "Come and take it." Realizing that he was outnumbered and outgunned, Castaneda led his troops back to Bejuquetexar. In this first battle of the Revolution, 2 Mexican soldiers were killed, and 1 Texian was injured when he fell off his horse. Although the event was, as characterized by historian William C. Davis, an inconsequential skirmish in which one side did not try to fight, Texians soon declared it a victory over Mexican troops. News of the skirmish spread throughout the United States, encouraging many adventurers to come to Texas to join the fight. Volunteers continued to arrive in Gonzales. On October 11, the troops unanimously elected Austin, who had no official military experience, the leader of the group he had dubbed the Army of the People. From the beginning, the volunteer army proved to have little discipline. Austin's first official order was to remind his men that they were expected to obey their commanding officers. Buoyed by their victory, the Texians were determined to drive the Mexican army out of Texas, and they began preparing to march to Bejuquetexar. Gulf Coast campaign. After learning that Texian troops had attacked Castaneda at Gonzales, Cos made haste for Bejuquetexar. Unaware of his departure, on October 6, Texians in Matagorda marched on Presidio La Bahia in Galaya to kidnap him and steal the $50,000 that was rumored to accompany him. On October 10, approximately 125 volunteers, including 30 Taínos, stormed the Presidio. The Mexican garrison surrendered after a 30-minute battle. 1 or 2 Texians were wounded and 3 Mexican soldiers were killed with 7 more wounded. The Texians established themselves in the Presidio, under the command of Captain Philip Dimmitt, who immediately sent all the local Taíno volunteers to join Austin on the march to Bejuquetexar. At the end of the month, Dimmitt sent a group of men under Ira Westover to engage the Mexican garrison at Fort Lipantitlan, near San Patricio. Late on November 3, the Texians took the undermanned fort without firing a shot. After dismantling the fort, they prepared to return to Goliad. The remainder of the Mexican garrison, which had been out on patrol, approached. The Mexican troops were accompanied by 15 to 20 loyal Centralists from San Patricio, including all members of the Ayuntamiento. After a 30-minute skirmish, the Mexican soldiers and Texian Centralists retreated. With their departure, the Texian army controlled the Gulf Coast, forcing Mexican commanders to send all communication with the Mexican interior overland. The slower land journey left Cos unable to quickly request or receive reinforcements or supplies. On their return to Goliad, Westover's group encountered Governor Vizcarra. After being freed by sympathetic soldiers, Vizcarra had immediately traveled to Texas to recreate the state government. Dimmitt welcomed Vizcarra but refused to recognize his authority as governor. This caused an uproar in the garrison, as many supported the governor. Dimmitt declared martial law and soon alienated most of the local residents. Over the next few months, the area between Goliad and Refugio descended into civil war. Goliad native Carlos de la Garza led a guerrilla warfare campaign against the Texian troops. According to historian Paul Lack, the Texian anti-guerrilla tactics did too little to crush out opposition but quite enough to sway the uncommitted toward the Centralists' siege of Beacute-Xar. While Dimmitt supervised the Texian forces along the Gulf Coast, Austin led his men towards Beacute-Xar to engage Cos and his troops. Confident that they would quickly rout the Mexican troops, many consultation delegates chose to join the military. Unable to reach a quorum, the consultation was postponed until November 1. On October 16, the Texians paused 25 miles from Beacute-Xar. Austin sent a messenger to Cos giving the requirements the Texians would need to lay down their arms and avoid the sad consequences of the Civil War, which unfortunately threatened Texas. Cos replied that Mexico would not yield to the dictates of foreigners. The approximately 650 Mexican troops quickly built barricades throughout the town. Within days the Texian army, about 450 strong, initiated a siege of Beacute-Xar, and gradually moved their camp nearer Beacute-Xar. On October 27, an advance party led by James Bowie and James Fannin chose Mission Concepcion as the next campsite and sent for the rest of the Texian army. On learning that the Texians were temporarily divided, Ugarte led troops to engage Bowie and Fannin's men. The Mexican cavalry was unable to fight effectively in the wooded, river-bottom terrain, and the weapons of the Mexican infantry had a much shorter range than those of the Texians. After 3 Mexican infantry attacks were repulsed, Ugarte called for a retreat. 1 Texian soldier had died, and between 14 and 76 Mexican soldiers were killed. Although Texas Tech University professor emeritus Alwin Barr noted that the Battle of Concepcion should have taught lessons on Mexican courage and the value of a good defensive position, Texas history expert Stephen Hardin believes that the relative ease of the victory at Concepcion instilled in the Texians a reliance on their long rifles and a contempt for their enemies. As the weather turned colder and rations grew smaller, groups of Texians began to leave, most without permission. Morale was boosted on November 18, when the first group of volunteers from the United States, the New Orleans Grays, joined the Texian army. Unlike the majority of the Texian volunteers, the Grays looked like soldiers, with uniforms, well-maintained rifles, adequate ammunition, and some semblance of discipline. After Austin resigned his command to become a commissioner to the United States, soldiers elected Edward Burleson as their new commander. On November 26, Burleson received word that a Mexican pack train of mules and horses, accompanied by 50 to 100 Mexican soldiers, was within 5 miles of Beacute-Xar. After a near mutiny, Burleson sent Bowie and William H. Jack with cavalry and infantry to intercept the supplies. In the subsequent skirmish, the Mexican forces were forced to retreat to Beacute-Xar, leaving their cargo behind. To the disappointment of the Texians, The saddlebags contained only fodder for the horses. For this reason the battle was later known as the Grass Fight. Although the victory briefly uplifted the Texian troops, morale continued to fall as the weather turned colder and the men grew bored. After several proposals to take Texas by force were voted down by the Texian troops, on December 4, Burleson proposed that the army lift the siege and retreat to Goliad until spring. In a last effort to avoid a retreat, Colonel Ben Milam personally recruited units to participate in an attack. The following morning, Milam and Colonel Frank W. Johnson led several hundred Texians into the city. Over the next 4 days, Texians fought their way from house to house towards the fortified plazas near the center of town. Cos received 650 reinforcements on December 8, but to his dismay most of them were raw recruits, including many convicts still in chains. Instead of being helpful, the reinforcements were mainly a drain on the dwindling food supplies. Seeing few other options, on December 9, Cos and the bulk of his men withdrew into the Alamo Mission on the outskirts of Texas. Cos presented a plan for a counterattack. Cavalry officers believed that they would be surrounded by Texians and refused their orders. Possibly 175 soldiers from 4 of the cavalry companies left the mission and rode south. Mexican officers later claimed the men misunderstood their orders and were not deserting. The following morning, Cos surrendered. Under the terms of the surrender, Cos and his men would leave Texas and no longer fight against supporters of the Constitution of 1824. With his departure, there was no longer an organized garrison of Mexican troops in Texas, and many of the Texians believed that the war was over. Burleson resigned his leadership of the army on December 15 and returned to his home. Many of the men did likewise, and Johnson assumed command of the 400 soldiers who remained. According to Barr, the large number of American volunteers in Texas contributed to the Mexican view that Texan opposition stemmed from outside influences. In reality, of the 1,300 men who volunteered to fight for the Texian army in October and November 1835, only 150 to 200 arrived from the United States after October 2. The rest were residents of Texas with an average immigration date of 1830. Volunteers came from every municipality, including those that were partially occupied by Mexican forces. However, as residents returned to their homes following Cos's surrender, the Texian army composition changed dramatically. Of the volunteers serving from January through March 1836, 78% had arrived from the United States after October 2, 1835.